Dan, you haven't taken a note on my dress today. I'm a little offended. Do I not look a little different? Notice
You do. You
what's
do look a
different
little
about me
different,
today?
Joda. I
Yeah,
like the
and
bow tie. You're going for the classic Tucker Carlson look.
Tucker. I was actually thinking. I guess Tucker would be one. I was kind of going for what's the gentleman from America's Test Kitchen? What was that guy's name?
Oh, I don't know. I remember
Yeah,
that show
I was
though.
kind of feel like I look kind of like him a little bit. So
You've been
obviously
test
this.
podcasting today.
Yeah, exactly. So I just, people have told me I need to change it up a little bit, and why? Because of perception, and I dress down too much. Sometimes people suggest, and I want to talk about that, but not right now. As we get into the next segment, and for this first segment that we're going to be doing, we're going to talk about bias in the workplace, and
There's no such thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
come on. Bias in the workplace.
So what? Yeah. So Dan, when I say that, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Search committees and hiring people. I think that's where a lot of focus on bias in my work comes in, right? You go through anti-bias training to help with recruiting, and we have inclusion advocates that are not voting members of the search committee, but are there to monitor things to make sure every applicant gets a fair shake in the hiring process.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Because you have to leverage, or do you? You have to leverage your past experiences, or is that what you don't do? Are you supposed to ignore?
Well, it depends. A term that we like to use is trying to screen people in rather than screen them out. Like, are we using arbitrary or unfair criteria to say, well, this person just wouldn't be good for this role? Do they have transferable skills? We like to talk about transferable skills, but at the same time, sometimes when you're in the hiring process, people don't really look at that. They get stuck on do they have this exact experience that we're looking for? And if they don't, then they get screened out. But hey, somebody can get trained up to do a job, and I think that's something that we need to be more open to.
Yeah, no, agreed. I remember when I went for a job a couple of years ago, and I didn't get it, which is fine. It was a upper level management position, and it was through a recruiter. And fortunately for me, and that's why I love recruiters, is you'll sometimes actually glean some insight as to why things didn't go or why they did select you. They said that I didn't look the part, in not so many words. Admittedly, it was during COVID. I definitely down dressed, and we'll talk about dress later on, I think. But I was really hurt by that. I think philosophically speaking, and it really opened up the space or the questioning of why is around the area of like what are the misperceptions and miscues, and how much bias affects job performance, job promotions, job getting a job, and I wonder how much of that perception affects us from an organization, from a workplace position. How much it affects the dollar amount,
Well, I think bias affects everything. So let's talk about what bias is. This episode's kind of framed around perceptions, which is tied to bias. So
it is.
How would you define bias? What is a bias?
A bias is a pre-framed framework that is defined, or a model that is defined in one's head, that they superimpose upon the world around them. And so it's prejudice by nature. It leverages your
Is
past.
it? I guess. Because there are good biases too.
Prejudges.
There are good biases.
Prejudges is what I'm saying. It's prejudges by nature.
Okay. Are there good biases?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's still a prejudgment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying prejudges by.
My issue with bias and the whole bias conversation is that it's very limited, right? Like, we tend to focus on like negative biases, but there's evolutionary reasons why we have a bias. right? And I think that's important to get at as well, right? We have a bias toward our own children, and we want to have a bias toward our own children so that we can protect them, keep our genes in the gene pool, so that they can go out and procreate and stuff like that. So there are good biases like that, and we definitely, because of the way we have evolved as humans, we're very tribal, right? We tend to identify with our in-group and the people who look like us and associate with us and share the customs and stuff like that. There can be good aspects to that kind of bias, and there can be definitely bad aspects to that kind of bias that can lead to racism and xenophobia and things like that. So I think it's really important to have a balanced perspective on bias, because it just is, right? At the end of the day, bias just is. It's an evolutionary trait that has some benefits to it, and also has some drawbacks to it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to make. As you mentioned, we try to limit our caloric usage, basically, right? We don't want to use our energy having to reprocess everything. So we develop models of the world around us, and we lean on those models. But it's where they get in the way of reality that causes a problem. And you have to, and there's confirmation bias, and that where one is constantly looking for examples in the world that prove their reality. We see that a lot. There's self-serving bias, where the tendency to attribute one's own success to internal factors and blame one's own failures on external factors. And a good example would be like a professional football team or a high school football team. They win a game and they say, "Yay, we did it! Our skills are amazing." And then next week they lose and they go, "The refs suck. They didn't judge us right. We didn't get a fair play on that one." That would be an example of self-serving bias. There's selective perception, which is the tendency to selectively interpret what is seen based on one's interests, background. That's a huge one, I think. That kind of goes to some degree the hiring perspective, right? You walk into your hiring and like you said, you're looking for something specific, and it might not open your mind enough to see, you know what, this might not be specific. That might not be exactly what I was looking for, but holy crap, this person satisfies most of the needs, and we're going to get more out of it. And I have actually personal anecdote story on that one. I went for a job years ago, probably 15 years ago, and I walked in this job. It was a UX position of some sort at a new startup, and I pitched who I was. The guy called me back a day later. He goes, "Joda, you know what? Honestly, you did not fit the role that we were looking for, but you fit this role that we want to have, and we'd like to hire you for that role." That person was literally allowing himself to keep an open mind about the value that was presented to him, not basically allowing self-selective perception get in the way. And
I disagree with that. I disagree with your interpretation of that. I think they were probably.
I know you do. You always do. But go on. Continue.
Well, I know. I mean, I'm just saying, like, they were probably already looking for that position, and you were a better fit based on your skill set and temperament and personality and whatever other criteria they're assessing for that particular job. They wanted it. They're not just creating it for you.
Yeah, Dan, but you got to be honest. And when you're going in for a job interview, that's rare to happen. Usually it's because
it is rare to happen
because they're narrowing, looking for that one specific thing.
Although I'm seeing it happen more and more. And
that's cool.
We're going to talk a little bit about ageism later in the show. And when we get to ageism, I want to talk about environmental factors that can affect hiring, right?
Okay.
And I think we're going to start seeing a trend where people are going to be forced to be a little bit more open-minded because of demographic changes.
Yeah, and that leans into stereotypes, right? And that's a big one. I feel like, there's a lot of things that are around biases, and that's a good umbrella term, biases. Stereotype, I think, is kind of another big bias. You stereotype, or a big umbrella term. You're stereotyping people. And one of the interesting things, I think, we talk about stereotypes of race, stereotypes of age, stereotypes of what are other there's the big
gender.
There's big ones, right, that we talk about, and we should talk about those things. Class. Yes, you're right. In the workplace, but in the workplace specifically, I found it interesting that we never talk about attractiveness, and it seems like it's the ugly child in that one. And the funny thing is, what people perceive as good looking or attractive is one of the biggest biases that we have actually in the workplace.
Listen to more of the Sense and Signal Leadership and Sense Making podcast.